All right, I'm back, and we're going to move on to the next part of Chapter 11. Sorry, it's taken me a while to get this posted. I kind of had holiday break just like y'all, so hopefully you haven't put off everything. We're going to start on page 354, focusing on urban pop culture. I'm going to skip the section on Sex and the City. I don't think that it's necessary. So, starting on page 354, urban pop culture. As utopians organized communities in the countryside, rural migrants and foreign immigrants created a new urban culture. In 1800, American cities were overgrown towns with rising death rates. New York had only 60,000 residents. Philadelphia had 41,000, and life expectancy at birth was a mere 25 years. Then urban growth accelerated as a huge in-migration outweighed the high death rates. By 1840, New York's population had ballooned to 312,000. Philadelphia and its suburbs had 150,000 residents, and three other cities, New Orleans, Boston, and Baltimore, each had about 100,000. By 1860, New York had become a metropolis with more than 1 million residents, 813,000 in Manhattan, and another 266,000 in the adjacent community of Brooklyn. We're going to skip over to page 355 now, focusing on minstrelsy. Popular entertainment was a central facet of the new urban culture. In New York, working men could partake of traditional rural blood. Did I miss a page? Oh, excuse me. Rural blood sports, rat and terrier fights, as well as boxing matches, as sportsman hall, or they could seek drink and fun in billiard and bowling saloons. Other workers crowded into the pit of Bowery Theater to see the mad tragedian, I don't even know how to say that, tragedian, Tragedian, Junius Brutus Booth deliver a stirring yet abridged performance of Shakespeare's Richard III. Reform-minded couples enjoyed evenings at the huge Broadway Tabernacle, where they could hear an abolitionist lecture, see the renowned Hutchinson family singers lead a roof-raising rendition of their anti-slavery anthem, Get Off the Track, and sentimentally lament the separation of a slave couple in Stephen Foster's Oh, Susanna, a popular song of the late 1840s. Families could visit the Museum of Oddities and Hoaxes, created by P.T. Barnum, the great cultural entrepreneur and founder of the Barnum and Bailey Circus. However, the most popular theatrical entertainments were the minstrel shows in which white actors in blackface presented comic routines that combined racist caricature and social criticism. Minstrelsy began around 1830, and when a few actors put on blackface and performed song and dance routines. Now, minstrelsy is a vocabulary term you'll need to know. The most famous was John Dartmouth Rice, whose Jim Crow blended a weird shuffle dance and jump with unintelligible lyrics delivered in Negro dialect. By the 1840s, there were hundreds of minstrel troupes, including a group of black entertainers, Gravit's original Ethiopian serenaders. The actor-singer's rambling lyrics poked racist fun at African Americans, portraying them as lazy, sensual, and irresponsible, while simultaneously using them to criticize white society. Minstrels ridiculed the drunkenness of Irish immigrants, parodied the halting English of German immigrants, denounced women's demands for political rights, and mocked the arrogance of upper-class men. Still, by caricaturing blacks, the minstrels declared the importance of being white and spread racist sentiments among Irish and German immigrants. And so now we'll take a look at the section that's entitled Immigrant Masses and Nativist Reaction on page 356. By 1850, immigrants were a major presence throughout the Northeast. Irish men and women in New York City numbered 200,000 and Germans 110,000. German-language shop signs filled entire neighborhoods, and German foods, including sausages, hamburgers, and sauerkraut, and food customs such as drinking beer in family beer gardens, became part of the city's culture. The mass of impoverished Irish migrants found allies in the American Catholic Church, which soon became an Irish-dominated institution, and the Democratic Party, which gave them a foothold in the political process. Native-born New Yorkers took alarm as hordes of ethnically diverse migrants altered the city's culture. They organized a nativist movement, a final aspect of the new urban world. Beginning in the mid-1830s, nativists called for a halt to immigration and mounted a cultural and political assault on foreign-born residents. Gangs of Bahoys, B''Hoys, assaulted Irish youths in the streets. Employers restricted Irish workers to the most menial jobs, and temperance reformers denounced the German fondness for beer. In 1844, the American Republican Party, with the endorsement of the Whigs, swept the city elections by focusing on the culturally emotional issue of temperance, anti-Catholic, goodness if I could read today, anti-Catholicism, and nativism. In the city, as in the countryside, new values were challenging old beliefs. The sexual freedom celebrated by Noyes at Oneida had its counterpart in commercialized sex and male promiscuity in New York City, where it came under attack from the Female Moral Reform Society. Similarly, the disciplined rejection of tobacco and alcohol by the Shakers and the Mormons found a parallel in the Washington Temperance Society and other urban reform organizations. American society was in ferment, and the outcome was far from clear. Now we're going to talk about abolitionism, and that is a term you will need to have in your notes. Like other reform movements, the abolitionist crusade of the 1830s drew on the religious enthusiasm of the Second Great Awakening. Around 1800, anti-slavery activists had assailed human bondage as contrary to republicanism and liberty. 3 decades later, white abolitionists condemned slavery as a sin and demanded immediate, uncompensated emancipation. Their upcoming stance led to fierce political debates, urban riots, and sectional conflict. Black social thought, uplift, race equality, and rebellion. Beginning in the 1790s, leading African Americans in the North advocated a strategy of social uplift, encouraging free Blacks to elevate themselves through education, temperance, and hard work. By securing respectability, they argued Blacks could become the social equals of whites. To promote that goal, Black leaders, men such as James Forten, a Philadelphia sailmaker, Prince Hall, a Boston barber, and ministers Hosea Easton and Richard Allen, founded an array of churches, schools, and self-help associations. Capping this effort, John Russwurm and Samuel D. Cornish of New York published the first African-American newspaper entitled Freedom's Journal in 1827. The Black quest for respectability elicited a violent response in Boston, Pittsburgh, and other northern cities among whites who refused to accept African Americans as their social equals. Quote, "I am Mr. Blank's help," end quote, a white maid informed a British visitor. Quote, "I am no servant. None but niggers are servants," end quote. Motivated by racial contempt, white mobs terrorized Black communities. The attacks in Cincinnati were so violent and destructive that several hundred African Americans fled to Canada for safety. David Walker's appeal. Responding to the attacks, David Walker published a stirring pamphlet, An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, published in 1829, protesting Black wretchedness in this Republican land of liberty. Walker was a free Black from North Carolina who had moved to Boston, where he sold secondhand clothes and copies of Freedman's Journal. A self-educated author, Walker ridiculed the religious pretensions of slaveholders, justified slave rebellion, and in biblical language warned of a slave revolt if justice were to be delayed. "We must and shall be free," he told white Americans, "and woe, woe will it be to you if we have to obtain our freedom by fighting. Your destruction is at hand and will be speedily consummated unless you repent." Walker's pamphlet quickly went through 3 printings and, carried by Black merchant seamen, reached free African Americans in the South. In 1830, Walker and other African American activists called a national convention in Philadelphia. The delegates refused to endorse either Walker's radical call for a slave revolt or the traditional program of uplift for free Blacks. Instead, this new generation of activists demanded freedom and race equality for those of African descent. They urged free Blacks to use every legal means, including petitions and other forms of political protest, to break the shackles of slavery. And so now we'll read about Nat Turner's revolt. Nat Turner is someone you need to make sure you have included in your notes. As Walker threatened violence in Boston, Nat Turner, a slave in Southampton County, Virginia, staged a bloody revolt, a chronological coincidence that had far-reaching consequences. As a child, Turner had taught himself to read and had hoped for emancipation, but one new master forced him into the fields and another separated him from his wife. Becoming deeply spiritual, Turner had a religious vision in which the Spirit explained that Christ had laid down in the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and that I should take it on and fight against the serpent, for the time was fast approaching when the first should be last and the last should be first. Taking an eclipse of the sun in August 1831 as an omen, Turner and a handful of relatives and friends rose in rebellion and killed at least 55 white men, women, and children. Turner hoped that hundreds of slaves would rally to his cause, but he mustered only 60 men. The white militia quickly dispersed his poorly armed force and took their revenge. One company of cavalry killed 40 blacks in 2 days and put 15 of their heads on poles to warn all those who should undertake a similar plot. Turner died by hanging, still identifying his mission with that of his Savior. Was not Christ crucified? He asked. Deeply shaken by Turner's rebellion, the Virginia Assembly debated a law providing for gradual emancipation and colonization abroad. When the bill failed by a vote of 73 to 58, the possibility that Southern planters would voluntarily end slavery was gone forever. Instead, the Southern states toughened their slave codes, limited black movement, and prohibited anyone from teaching slaves to read. They would meet Walker's radical appeal with radical measures of their own. Now we'll take a look at evangelical abolitionism. Rejecting Walker's and Turner's resort to violence, a cadre of Northern evangelical Christians launched a moral crusade to abolish the slave regime. If planters did not allow blacks their God-given status as free moral agents, these radical Christians warned they faced eternal damnation at the hands of a just God. So now let's read about William Lloyd Garrison, Theodore Weld, and Angelina and Sarah Grimke. The most determined abolitionist was William Lloyd Garrison. A Massachusetts-born printer, Garrison had worked during the 1820s in Baltimore on an anti-slavery newspaper, The Genius of Universal Emancipation. In 1830, Garrison went to jail, convicted of libeling a New England merchant engaged in the domestic slave trade. In 1831, Garrison moved to Boston, where he immediately started his own weekly, The Liberator, published from 1831 to 1865, and founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society. Influenced by a bold pamphlet, Immediate, Not Gradual Emancipation in 1824, by an English Quaker, Elizabeth Coltman Hayrick, Garrison demanded immediate abolition without compensation to slaveholders. I will not retreat a single inch, he declared, and I will be heard. Garrison accused the American Colonization Society of perpetuating slavery and assailed the U.S. Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell because it implicitly accepted racial bondage. In 1833, Garrison, Theodore Weld, and 60 other rebellious abolitionists, black and white, established the American Anti-Slavery Society. And the American Anti-Slavery Society is something that I want you to make note of. The society won financial support from Arthur and Louis Tappan, wealthy silk merchants in New York City. Women abolitionists established separate groups, including the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, founded by Lucretia Mott in 1833, and the Anti-Slavery Conventions of American Women, a network of local societies. The women raised money for the Liberator and carried the movement to the farm villages and small towns of the Midwest, where they distributed abolitionist literature and collected thousands of signatures on anti-slavery petitions. Abolitionist leaders launched a three-pronged plan of attack. To win the support of religious Americans, Weld published The Bible Against Slavery in 1837, which used passages from Christianity's holiest book to discredit slavery. 2 years later, Weld teamed up with the Grimke sisters, Angelina, whom he had married, and Sarah. The Grimkes had left their father's plantation in South Carolina, converted to Quakerism, and taken up the abolitionist cause in Philadelphia. In American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of a Thousand Witnesses, published in 1839, Weld and the Grimkes addressed a simple question: what is the actual condition of the slaves in the United States? Using reports from Southern newspapers and firsthand testimony, they presented incriminating evidence of the inherent violence of slavery. Angelina Grimke told of a treadmill that South Carolina slave owners used for punishment. One poor girl who was sent there to be flogged and who was accordingly stripped naked and whipped showed me the deep gashes on her back. I might have laid my whole finger in them. Large pieces of flesh had actually been cut out by the torturing lash. Filled with such images of pain and suffering, the book sold more than 100,000 copies in a single year. So now we'll read about the American Anti-Slavery Society. To spread their message, the abolitionists turned to mass communication. Using new steam-powered presses to print 1 million pamphlets, the American Anti-Slavery Society carried out a great postal campaign in 1835, flooding the nation, including the South, with its literature. The abolitionists' second tactic was to aid fugitive slaves. They provided lodging and jobs for escaped blacks in free states and created the Underground Railroad, an informal network of whites and free blacks in Richmond, Charleston, and other southern towns that assisted fugitives. In Baltimore, a free African-American sailor loaned his identification papers to future abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who used them to escape to New York. Harriet Tubman and other runaways risked re-enslavement or death by returning repeatedly to the South to help others escape. I should fight for liberty as long as my strength lasted, Tubman explained, and when the time came for me to go, the Lord would let them take me. Thanks to the railroad, about 1,000 African Americans reached freedom in the North each year. There they faced an uncertain future because most whites continued to reject civic or social equality for African Americans. Voters in 6 northern and Midwestern states adopted constitutional amendments that denied or limited the franchise for free blacks. Remember, franchise means the right to vote. We want no masters, declared a New York artisan, and least of all, no Negro masters. Moreover, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, keep that in your notes, allowed owners and their hired slave catchers to seize suspected runaways and return them to bondage. To thwart these efforts, white abolitionists and free blacks formed mobs that attacked slave catchers, released their captives, and often spirited them off to British-ruled Canada, which refused to extradite fugitive slaves. A political campaign was the first element of the abolitionist program. Between 1835 and 1838, the American Anti-Slavery Society bombarded Congress with petitions containing nearly 500,000 signatures. They demanded the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia, an end to the interstate slave trade, and a ban on admission of new slave states. Thousands of deeply religious farmers and small-town proprietors supported these efforts. The number of local abolitionist societies grew from 200 in 1835 to 2,000 by 1840, with nearly 200,000 members, including many transcendentalists. Emerson condemned Americans for supporting slavery, and Thoreau, viewing the Mexican War as a naked scheme to extend slavery, refused to pay taxes and submitted to arrest. In 1848, he published Resistance to Civil Government, an essay urging individuals to follow a higher moral law. The black abolitionist Henry Highland Garnett went further. His address to the slaves of the United States in 1841 called for liberty or death and urged slave resistance, resistance, resistance. Obviously, there's going to be opposition and internal conflict, which is our next section. Still, abolitionists remained a minority, even among churchgoers. Perhaps 10% of Northerners and Midwesterners strongly supported the movement, and only another 20% were sympathetic to its goals. Slavery's proponents were more numerous and equally aggressive. The abolitionist agitation, ministers warned, risked embroiling neighborhoods and families, setting friend against friend, overthrowing churches and institutions of learning, embittering one portion of the land against the other. Wealthy men feared that the attack on slave property might become an assault on all property rights. Conservative clergymen condemned the public roles assumed by abolitionist women, and Northern wage earners feared that freed blacks would work for lower wages and take their jobs. Reach of slavery. Northern merchants and textile manufacturers supported the Southern planters who supplied them with cotton, as did hog farmers in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and pork packers in Cincinnati and Chicago, who profited from lucrative sale to slave plantations. Finally, whites almost universally opposed amalgamation, and amalgamation is a term I want in your notes, the racial mixing and intermarriage that Garrison seemed to support by holding meetings of blacks and whites of both sexes. And hatreds led to violent mob actions. White workers in northern towns laid waste to taverns and brothels where blacks and whites mixed, and they vandalized respectable African American churches, temperance halls, and orphanages. A mob of 1,500 New Yorkers stormed a church in search of Garrison and Arthur Tappan. Another white mob swept through Philadelphia's African American neighborhoods, clubbing and stoning residents and destroying homes and churches. In 1835, gentlemen of property and standing, including lawyers, merchants, and bankers, broke up an abolitionist convention in Utica, New York. 2 years later, a mob in Alton, Illinois, shot and killed Elijah P. Lovejoy, editor of the abolitionist Alton Observer. By pressing for emancipation and equality, the abolitionists had revealed the extent of racial prejudice and had heightened race consciousness, as both whites and blacks identified across class lines with members of their own race. Solidarity was especially strong in the South, where whites banned abolitionists. The legislature offered a $5,000 reward for kidnapping Garrison and bringing him to the South to be tried or lynched for inciting rebellion. Vigilantes whipped a Northern college student for distributing abolitionist pamphlets. In Charleston, a mob attacked the office and destroyed sacks of abolitionist mail. After 1835, Southern postmasters simply refused to deliver mail suspected to be of abolitionist origin. Politicians joined the fray. President Andrew Jackson, a longtime slave owner, asked Congress in 1835 to restrict the use of the mails by abolitionist groups. Congress refused. The House of Representatives adopted the so-called gag rule. Rule is, under this informal agreement, which remained in force until 1844, the House automatically tabbed anti-slavery petitions, keeping the explosive issue of slavery off the congressional stage. To internal divisions on page 365. Assailed by racists from the outside, evangelical abolitionists fought amongst themselves over gender issues. Many anti-slavery clergymen this role for women, but Garrison had broadened his reform agenda to include pacifism, the abolition of prisons and women's rights. Our object is universal emancipation, to redeem women as well as men from a servile to an equal condition. Garrison's demand that the American Anti-Slavery Society support women's rights split the abolitionist movement. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among others, remained with Garrison and the American Anti-Slavery Society and assailed both the institutions that bound blacks and the customs that constrained free women. Opponents founded a new organization, the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, which turned to politics. Its members mobilized their churches to oppose racial bondage and organized the Liberty Party, the first anti-slavery political party. In 1840, the new party nominated James G. Birney, a former Alabama slave owner, for president. Birney and the Liberty Party argued that the Constitution did not recognize slavery and consequently that slaves become free when they entered areas of federal authority, such as the District of Columbia and the National Territories. However, Birney won few votes, and the future of political abolitionism appeared dim. Violence in the North, government-aided suppression in the South, and internal schisms stunned the abolitionist movement. By melding the energies and ideas of evangelical Protestants, moral reformers, and transcendentalists, it had raised the banner of anti-slavery to new heights, only to face a hostile backlash. When we first unfurled the banner of the Liberator, Garrison admitted, "It did not occur to us that nearly every religious sect and every political party would side with the oppressor." All right, I'm going to end there for section 2. We'll pick up with section 3 next, which is the women's rights movement.